All right, we're recording now, so just letting you all know. All right, let me get this slideshow. All right, so this class is called Negotiating the ICA, AKA also known as Bill's least favorite part of the real estate transaction. I'll be quite honest, I hate the ICA process. Dealing with inspection issues and picky buyers, even if they're my own buyers, getting estimates, monitoring repairs, arguing with sellers. Of course, you try not to argue with your clients, but it's like, first they would have been happy to get one price and now they're getting even more. And now now they're upset that they have to, put in $1,000 rate on air system that should have been their responsibility anyway, because they should have known about it. So anyway, I'm not a big fan of the ICA process, but it's part of the business. We'll talk about a little bit. I am a big believer that sellers should be pre-inspecting their own homes, pre-testing everything, I know in some other states, although I've never sold real estate in another state, but I've heard stories, and in some other states, the title process is done ahead of time, the inspection process is done ahead of time. And so by the time the buyer comes in, everything is either A, good to go, or B, just simply disclosed. I mean, buyers are generally very willing to deal with issues or negotiate based on issues they knew up front. But when, like I tell sellers, when you haven't done what you need to do and the buyer is the one discovering issues with your home and telling you about them, they feel a whole lot differently, about those things, and they feel entitled that the seller should take care of it. So, anytime you can, take a listing and get a seller to do some pre-inspections, do some testing ahead of time, it's going to make for a way smoother process. There's going to be way less renegotiating happening later. And if there are repairs, it gives the seller a chance to get, multiple competitive estimates and get things fixed on their time schedule. And anyway, that's if I was king for a day, that I would just make that a rule, because I think buyers having to spend $1,000, $1,200 to do all these inspections or tests, and then the septic's failed and the seller won't fix it and the buyer has to walk and they've wasted all this money. Like, to me, that's just a broken process. But anyway, I'll stop ranting now and get into the material. As with all our classes, these things are interactive. I want them to be interactive. I want and need your questions and comments. Some of you are muted, some of you aren't. That's up to you, but feel free to butt in at any time, raise a question, make a comment. The classes are all recorded to go on our YouTube channel. So obviously for somebody watching later, they're going to have, they're not going to have the ability to ask questions or interject. So kind of need you guys to do that for everyone. So anyway, we're gonna start at the point. I'm not really gonna cover the form itself. I mean, I think everyone's fairly familiar with the form. I mean, obviously, the ICA form, the first section, you can ask to extend the date, if you need to. I'm seeing that happening a lot because buyers and agents are putting really quick inspection periods, if they're putting inspections at all, but they're putting, quick inspection periods to try to make the offer more appealing to the seller. And then sometimes they're finding that they've caught themselves a little close, on the timing or getting scheduled. I still think it's funny. Every day I have somebody, someone in the community say, how crazy they think the market is. And of course they think they mean busy. And I'm like, well, it is crazy. But I said, the reason it's crazy is because we have extreme low inventory. So a lot of us are not extremely busy because there's not a lot of listings to list and there's not a lot of stuff to show our buyers. Yes, we have to jump very quickly for our buyers when something hits the market, but it's not really that busy. So a lot of the inspectors aren't particularly busy. I'm seeing stuff go under and the buyers are able to schedule their inspection, very easily within a couple days. Whether you're a buyer agent or a listing agent, some of the inspectors are really good about doing this, and some I've noticed they are not. But make sure that if you do have any background noise where you are, definitely please mute unless you have a comment or question, so we're not catching that background noise. But I am noticing, some of the inspectors are good about trying to get into the property ahead of time to set up radon or take a water sample, whatever. So if you're the buyer's agent, try to make that happen. If you're the listing agent and the buyer's agent or the inspector isn't trying to make that happen, you might want to, try to encourage that to happen, just to take some waiting off the other end. Obviously, this is a wicked tough time of year to have a seller have to close up, and not use their, air conditioning for radon testing or whatever, which is another reason why it's better to be done, some other time prior to ever listing the property for sale even. But in any event, so we're going to start, at the point where you're under contract, you're scheduling the inspections, the reports are starting to come in, and of course you're monitoring your deadlines. You're making really sure that you're not late with anything. I always think back, where I know Rusty and maybe some of the others in the class can relate. Back in the old days, if you had 10 days for inspections, all that meant is that you had to let the seller and their agent know about any of the issues within 10 days. And you had an indefinite period of time, essentially, to work things out until, you just reached a stalemate or whatever the case might be. And obviously that ran into some issues. So I don't know if it was 10 years ago or however long exactly, but the realtors changed the forms to be a hard deadline that, everything has to be, renegotiated by the deadline. So, you want to give, I'm still seeing situations where, the buyer agent isn't letting the listing agent know till 3 o'clock, before the 5 o'clock deadline on the final day. And, that obviously can relate to some issues. Now, if you've got, agents that know and trust each other, really well, or know each other, and you've got very agreeable clients, I mean, can you go past that deadline? I mean, you can. I suppose the buyer is the one that's a little bit more at risk. If you didn't feel like it was a trustworthy situation, and I'm not saying that you should do that, but I've had a few occasions where it was an agent that I knew and trusted, or they trusted me, and I simply told them, I said, look, we're not going to have an answer for you by 5, but you let us know, and my seller and I are still talking. And if we can't work this out, my seller is going to sign the earnest money release, I assure you. And again, that's a very rare situation, with a client that I could trust. But always better to probably put an extension in writing, or whatever. Again, perfect world, you've got no inspection issues, or the buyer is just electing to deal with the minor stuff that's come up, or again, maybe the seller did some pre-inspections and they disclosed some stuff, so the buyer knew about it. So that's just the beauty of the seller disclosing stuff, is that that stuff shouldn't come up again in renegotiation, because the buyer already knew about it. So but let's take the most common scenario where you've got some issues to deal with, and you're preparing that ICA for your buyer. To me, again, even though I hate this process, this is where the buyer agent and the listing agent can really earn their money if they can hold the deal together despite any issues that have arisen. And I've had the pleasure of working with a few agents in our company recently on some deals, and was impressed with how they handled the process, and or just felt lucky when their buyer didn't ask for anything. So that told me that their buyer was well counseled as to the market or what they should do or not do, and things worked out well. So I've already touched on this a little bit, but I'll try to give you a couple other strategies perhaps. But as a listing agent, you start setting the stage for this ICA negotiating process, very early on, even before you take the listing. Like I said, as far as perhaps convincing the seller to, do some pre-inspection stuff. In fact, I'll make a note. I've got a flyer that I use. I'll send that out to everyone, in case you want to use it. But I always, it's 1 out of 20 sellers maybe that I get to do pre-inspections. But at least you talk to them about it, and then later on when they have issues, I mean, obviously you'll never say I told you so, but they'll remember that you did discuss the option of doing their own inspections and finding out stuff ahead of time. But kind of just like humans won't go to the doctor sometimes to not find out bad news ahead of time. I think that's sellers just figure if they put their head in the sand and they don't look for problems, that maybe they'll never come up. And I suppose, you take water radon, for example. Like, a lot of buyers aren't doing that, even though to me, in order of importance, like, to me, the septic is the most important if it has any age on it. And then that's probably the most expensive thing that could come up that you can't visually see with your eyes. I mean, a roof, a boiler, stuff like that, you can kind of get your eyeballs on. But you take a septic system, radon water is like the second, most expensive thing to cure. So if you've got a buyer with limited funds and they can't do everything, I encourage my buyers to do stuff in the order of possible, cost first. And but then you take sellers and pre-inspections on the other hand. It's like, okay, well, most buyers aren't doing radon water, even though they probably should. So it's like, as a seller, do you test for that and find out you have a problem that you now have to disclose? Even though the buyer might not have done it. So that's about the only one of the pre-inspections that sometimes can be a little bit of a gamble. But so you talk about that, you talk about pricing, obviously. Nobody wants to have an overpriced listing, not that we're getting too many of those in this market, but if my seller knows that they do have issues, or they do sort of have a bottom line, if I think we can build a little bit in there for negotiating or possible inspection stuff, ahead of time, then I try to do that. And we're already talking about inspections and the likelihood that something's going to come up that we're going to have to deal with. So so I'm talking about it even then. And then after we're listed and after we're getting offers, again, a lot of stuff is going for full price or over full price very quickly. If it goes for over full price, to me, you shouldn't have a problem, or the seller shouldn't have a problem, agreeing to pay for a deficiency, in their house if they're getting more than asking price. But I've still run into some situations where, 1 minute the seller's grateful and the next minute they feel entitled to get all the money and not fix anything. So that's the emotional part of the business, I guess, that we have to deal with. But I've had a few times where, back back in the old days, like a year ago, when we actually negotiated on some sales, where, the seller was basically, my seller was willing to take what the buyer was offering. And of course, you can do this situation in reverse with your buyer, but my seller was basically ready to agree, but I thought maybe they could extract another couple $1,000, $2,500 from the buyer. And so I told him, it's your choice, but I think you can get just a tiny bit more. And if we could do that and the buyer agrees, if anything comes up on inspections, we've got a little extra money to give away that, that originally we would have been happy, at a slightly lower price. And so that's worked for me a few times in my career. And again, the same goes for the buyer. It's sort of, if the buyer can get it for just a little bit less than they were willing to pay. And then, if they do find they have a stubborn seller who won't agree to fix something and the buyer has to take on a repair, then, that they were prepared for that. So anybody have any comments or questions at this point? I build these in, so I shut up for just a second and see if any of you have anything. Questions? Nothing? I'll keep going. All right. So talk about some buyer agent strategies, I guess. So let's say you've got some issues, that you need to deal with. Um, I think the most effective way, and again, some of you, this is probably a very basic strategy, so most of you are probably aware of this already, but if the seller isn't already paying buyer closing costs, then I think that's the easiest way to put money in the buyer's pocket, that they can deal with stuff after closing themselves. Hire their own contractors, supervise their own contractors, and just deal with stuff, themselves. And so I think that's the best way to do it. And this is assuming it's not a water test issue, and it's the type of loan where the lender has to get a copy of the water test, or it's a bad roof that you knew about ahead of time or something. I mean, a lot of the inspections issues are stuff that an appraiser would never notice. And so the parties are kind of free to negotiate that how they wish. This is the point, and again, a lot of you might already know this, so that's okay. But for those, if there's one or two that don't, but I always like to touch on the appraisal issue, because even to this day, I mean, I had to have a discussion with a buyer agent yesterday just to make sure that we didn't get burnt on it, because every once in a while I try to assume that, okay, well, this agent, I've heard of them, they're experienced, they're a good agent, so they're on top of it, and maybe they're busy and they're not on top of it. But again, if you've got a buyer and you're trying to close within a certain time frame, obviously, and we're dealing with a lot of busy appraisers these days, you want to make sure that your buyer's lender is jumping on ordering this appraisal. Now, obviously, you don't want to have the appraisal happen. You don't want to have the actual inspection happen until you've done your investigations and everything's been successfully negotiated, and that's fine. But you at least want to make sure the appraisal's ordered. And if you're a listing agent, you want to make sure the buyer agent, follows up with the buyer's lender and does the same, because in many cases I'm seeing the buyer agent doesn't address it, the lender is maybe a little lackadaisical, whatever, and they don't jump on getting that appraisal ordered, and that can easily cost you a week to 10 days in the process. I'll have buyer agents say, oh no, we want to wait and order the appraisal, till the investigations are all done, and I have to, of course, I'm shocked, and I'm like, well, I get that, but you want to order this thing, ahead of time, because it's going to take a week or 10 days easily, and sometimes longer in some cases nowadays, to even get an appraiser to accept the order. When I'm dealing with a buyer and I usually send them to the same lender, I make sure the lender puts me as the point of contact for the appraiser, so they're reaching out to me and not the listing agent to get access. Because the flip side of this is, if I'm the listing agent and the buyer agent hasn't addressed it, and again, we're kind of going back to the old days of a year ago or more, but there were cases where I was getting a call from an appraiser either before the inspections had happened, or maybe after the investigations had happened, but we hadn't negotiated anything yet. And the appraiser's asking for access. Well, I'm giving them access and I'm letting them in. And I'm letting that appraisal happen. So if that wasn't what was supposed to happen, then that's on the buyer agent or the lender or whatever. Alternatively, you might have buyers who want that appraisal information. Again, you're not going to get it faster than your investigations, I don't think, in this market anyway, but there have been times in the recent past when it could happen pretty quickly, and you might have buyers who want that information. They know they're not going to back out. They're just doing investigations for their own edification, but maybe they want that appraisal information to help them decide where to go with things. I mean, if the appraisal comes out higher than contract price, then maybe they're willing to overlook some inspection stuff that they wouldn't have otherwise. So any questions about the appraisal process or how that works with investigations or anything? Or okie dokie. So what if the buyer won't take closing costs, or they're already getting seller paid closing costs? Maybe the buyer is just really insistful that the seller take care of a certain repair, then what are your other options? I mean, obviously the seller could reduce the price, but that doesn't really, that obviously doesn't get the problem fixed, and that doesn't, put any money in the buyer's pocket like the closing costs, option would. So now you're dealing with, a different scenario where the seller is going to make the repairs and pay for those at the time of closing. So, that's obviously something that happens quite a bit. Sometimes you're going to run into a situation where there isn't a contractor available in time, especially right now. Try getting a contractor inside of a month to do some electrical work or plumbing work or put in a septic system. The contractor could still be paid out of proceeds and do the work after closing, again, if the buyer is agreeable to do that. There have been a few, I like to address this. It's very rare. I find that it'll come up. I even talked to Kevin Young from RMS, one of our top lenders for the offices, just to find out, his thoughts on it. But there were a few times in my 25-year career that a title company, we asked for something to be paid out of the seller proceeds, and, they wanted a receipt to show the work was completed, or something like that. And maybe we hadn't got the work done yet, and the buyer was fine with that. That's very rarely happened. Most of the time, if we're asking a title company to pay, Joe Smith, out of the seller's closing proceeds, they just throw that on the HUD and they don't ask any questions. And then there's a check at closing, and they usually ask, who wants the check, or are they supposed to just mail it to the contractor? And usually we just take possession of it and give it to the buyer and let them, pay the contractor upon, completion of the work. That has worked many times for me personally. As a buyer agent, how are you conveying, we'll back up a little bit, to the point that, okay, you're getting all this inspection info, now what do you do with it? Me personally, I start sending stuff immediately, of course, with my buyer's permission. But assuming there's issues, I start sending everything to the listing agent, because, my buyer's got time, they're getting time to review all this information and make a decision about what they want to do and how they want to move forward. I want, obviously I want a successful negotiation and outcome for them with the listing agent and the seller. So I want them to have, a fair amount of time to review all this information as well. So I might, again, with buyer's permission, start forwarding, reports as we're getting it to the listing agent, so that they can start reviewing it, pass it along to their seller, and hopefully see that, look, there's 30 issues, but the buyer's only asking for these 5 to get taken care of, or they're only asking for the most expensive 2 issues to be, to be compensated for those issues, or closing costs paid, or repairs made, or whatever. So that's kind of how I do it. I've probably got few too many of these comment or question breaks in there, but I want to make sure I give anyone a chance to jump in if they want.
Do you normally not submit that to the listing agent until you already know exactly what the buyer wants?
Again, in my case, I'm sending it again with I always want to throw in that with buyer's permission, but because every once in a while I'll have a buyer, no, we don't want you to share anything with them. Okay, fine. But if I think there's any chance we're going to be asking for anything, those reports can be like 70 pages long, with all the pictures and everything. So it can take a little while to review that. Maybe I'm just sending them the summary. I've had agents.
I'm sorry. I've never had a buyer that, and I've pretty much only worked mostly with buyers. What happens on the listing side if the buyer says, I don't want you to share that, I paid $500 or whatever to get that inspection don't share it. Then you just got a verbal,
Well, if the buyer's going to ask for something that, well, if the buyer's going to ask for anything, they're going to have to provide proof that there's an issue. Like,
that's what I'm, yeah.
They're not, unless it's something super obvious, they're not going to have much luck negotiating to get something like closing costs or repairs or whatever if they're not willing to share. At least now I've had buyer agents share with me just the section of the report that's applicable to what they're asking for. I guess my point is that sometimes you grease the skids for your buyer getting what they want by showing that, look, there were 30 issues, or there's a shit ton wrong with this house, but we're only asking for a couple things. And so sometimes you get an easier yes when you're willing to provide a preponderance of evidence. But no, you make a good point. Like I said, the buyers have paid good money. Like you said, the buyers have paid good money for that. Maybe they only want to share the issue with the septic or the issue with the boiler, or the mold, the discoloration, shall we call it, in the attic that could have been possible mold. So yeah, you can just share a certain page or section of a report, or with their permission, you can share the whole thing if you think that's going to make a stronger case.
Well, you at least want to encourage them to share items that they now have to disclose if they don't want to compensate.
Yeah, a lot of times agents get, buyer agents get really concerned about that. And I get that. Yes, it is in fact, the listing agent and the seller's responsibility to disclose certain issues. That's not really, we're not really the police for that. Hopefully, certainly I'm letting my seller know when I'm talking to them, especially if they're being difficult, like, they don't want to negotiate something. I'm kind of like, well, we can go back on the market if you want and disclose that the septic system's failed, or, that the furnace is on its last leg, but, this is going to come up again, so, but it's not really the buyer agent's job to, I've literally had buyer agents say, well, you're going to need to disclose this if you go back on the market. Well, it's like, yeah, I know that. I'm not stupid, but that's not really part of the negotiating strategy, as far as I'm concerned, for the buyer agent.
It doesn't nicely say, cooperate with my buyer, please.
I think it does. Like I said, I think it does. And again, you definitely have to provide evidence for anything you're asking for. And I think providing evidence of other stuff that's wrong, even if you're not asking for it, can help, get you what you want, because if they think there's just one issue and that's the one you're asking for, they might think, well, my house is in pretty good shape. This is the only thing wrong. You can take care of it, but if you demonstrate that, no, there's 20 issues with your house, this just happens to be the only one we're asking for you to take care of, we'll take care of all the others, then that shows kind of a cooperation, and sometimes that can, get you what you want. So there's no, if there's anything that I convey as part of this class, there's no specific playbook for how you do this. Every agent's going to do it a little bit differently. And if you've got a cooperating buyer and seller, then it's not going to matter what strategy you use. It's probably going to work out. If you've got a difficult buyer or a difficult seller, the whole thing could blow up, no matter what. I've had buyers walk away, my buyers walk away. I've had buyers walk away on my listing without even asking the seller to fix anything, which to me is just kind of ludicrous. I understand the failed septic is a major thing, but potentially you're going to get a brand new septic system out of this, so why wouldn't you ask for it? Why would you just walk away to try to find another house to put under contract, to spend more money to do inspections? Like, every house is going to have some issues, so when you get those buyers who just walk away without asking, without even attempting to negotiate a solution, that's super frustrating. And then you've got the sellers who just say, nope, I'm not doing anything. And that just kind of puts the buyer on, I've even had to let buyer agents or buyers know that a seller said they're not willing to negotiate anything. Go ahead and do your inspections, but we're not negotiating. And if I'm told by my seller to convey that, then I convey it. not in a threatening manner, but just sort of kind of to let the the buyer agent and the buyer know where the seller's at, so they go into the situation eyes wide open. It can be a very contentious process, which like I said, it's why it's my least favorite.
Can a seller say no inspections? Because I've heard this. Can they
Well, they can
tell a buyer
agree.
that you can't conduct any in the first place?
Well, they don't have to agree to a contract that has an inspection clause in it. I mean, to me, that would be highly suspicious. And, I mean, if they've got multiple offers and someone's offering to not do investigations, then that's great for the seller. But if it's the only offer that they have and they're simply refusing to let a buyer do investigations, as a buyer or a buyer agent, I would think that was pretty suspicious that they might have something to hide.
But they can. A seller could.
A seller, like I tell my sellers, the only time a seller is really in control of this process, because sellers feel pretty helpless at times once they go under contract, especially because of the ICA process. The buyer basically has an out. They don't have to say why. They can back out within 10 business days. And that can leave a seller feeling in a pretty precarious situation. And then they've still got to, they're still at the buyer's mercy as far as hopefully the buyer has submitted a good loan application. They haven't, misrepresented anything, or something, hidden and scary doesn't, come crawling out of their credit report or job history or something or whatever that blows the whole deal up. So, the seller is really at the buyers and lenders and appraisers' mercy for about 45 days. The only time that they're in control of anything is before they go under. And so, yes, without, violating federal law as far as, discrimination or anything like that. I mean, they get to choose the buyer they work with, the price they accept, the terms they accept. And I've never seen a seller in 25 years, absent of multiple offers, just simply refuse to let a buyer conduct inspections.
Okay.
But I suppose anything can happen. I've had a couple situations where buyers or buyer's agents, they put no inspections in their offer, and then you get the phone call, oh, well, we just want to do a radon test for our information only. So this puts you in a tough situation, because if you say no, have you got something to hide? But they said they weren't doing anything. And what if they've only got $1,000 earnest money or $500 earnest money, and they do some inspection or test for their information only, and then they decide to walk away? So to me, I wouldn't be doing that if I was a buyer or buyer's agent, because I think, we've had agents, listing agents pretty upset, or those have led to some contentious situations when the buyer wants to try to get access to do those things that they kind of said they weren't going to do. And their point is, well, we weren't making the contract contingent on it, but we still want to do them. So, this will go back to, again, the earnest money doesn't really do any good if the contract is contingent on inspections. But what I'd like to see, I mean, we have seen, buyers, back out for no reason, after the investigation process, nothing to do with appraisal, nothing to do with their loan. And, there was only $1,000 earnest money, and they were doing an FHA loan and putting 3% down on a $300,000 house. So, they're bringing $9,000 to closing. And in some cases they're paying their own closing costs. So there's more money there. I would definitely like to see, more earnest money come forward, either upfront or certainly after investigations. I can understand a buyer agent saying, we only want to do 1,000 upfront or whatever. But after the investigations, I could see a strong case for those earnest money deposits going up to protect the seller a little bit more now, in case the buyer backs out. But that's just kind of a side note, I guess. Um, do not negotiate piecemeal, and I put usually here, and so I'll sort of explain, my thought process there. And I've had it happen to me. I've had to do it in a few cases, for my buyers. Maybe potentially, let's say we thought maybe there was a strong possibility there was an issue with the septic system or the boiler or something. And before the buyer spent, $1,000 or more on radon air and water testing and a full building inspection and everything else, maybe we're having a contractor come in, or maybe we're doing separate, we're having separate people do the building inspection and the septic inspection, and maybe the septic inspector can get there early and we find out there's an issue with the septic system. Well, if we can't negotiate or agree that the seller's willing to repair the failed septic system, then there's no point in the buyer going forward and paying for all the other stuff. So I've had some instances where, we have negotiated something piecemeal ahead of time to save some time or money, going through the whole entire process. But I've also had buyer agents try to, they get the building inspection, the next day, let's say, but then, they're waiting for water tests, radon air tests, all this. Well, they want to start negotiating, the general building inspection items before we have the other stuff. And obviously sellers aren't usually going to be too keen on that. But in other cases, maybe they're fine because they're willing to correct all the issues they run across. But generally speaking, you're going to want to make sure that whether it's your buyer or you're the listing agent, that all the reports are in and we're negotiating everything all at once, one time, and reaching an agreement, to go forward. So if anyone's ever had that, come up, then that is something that can happen. So here's something that comes up a lot, I think, and I know this is being taught in a lot of the real estate classes right now, but should you as the listing agent be looking at and conveying inspection reports to your seller? I think from the last live class that I took or whatever, I feel like the general consensus in the real estate educator community is absolutely not. You should not be looking at any reports. You shouldn't be opening any emails that have reports attached to them. You should be returning those to the buyer agent and saying, no, we're not looking at anything. I'll be honest, I'm not a big fan of this, of that tactic. Again, we work for clients. We're just sort of middle men or women in this process. Our clients are really sort of in charge. So you may have to have a discussion with your client and find out where they stand on it. My concern is that if we are not able to successfully negotiate investigations and we go back on the market, we have items that we should be disclosing. We have issues that are going to come up again, but because we have chosen to turn a blind eye to the whole thing, we're going to end up just wasting time again and going under contract again, only to find out that, okay, yes, indeed, the septic is failed, and certainly if another agent informs me that, oh, by the way, the septic system at your listing is failed, I'm now in possession of that information. I don't have proof. Maybe I haven't been willing to look at the proof, but I'm now in possession of some information that, obviously I need to tell my seller what I was told. I have to convey everything to my seller that I know. And now we probably need to either prove or disprove, that that's correct. I mean, we can get a second opinion if we want, whatever. But even if that information is just simply verbal or in a text or an email, and I haven't looked at any official report, I'm now in possession of some information that could get me or my seller sued later. You know, let's say the next buyer doesn't do a septic inspection, the thing fails, and the same contractor or inspector ends up at the property and says, oh yeah, we told the listing agent that this was failed. Well, now guess who's getting sued, because they didn't disclose or they were party to a non-disclosure, issue. So again, something to definitely talk to your client about. Again, definitely not an issue if your seller does pre-inspections before listing. But you and your seller, I think, have to, discuss how you want to handle this, on a case-by-case basis. Does that raise any questions or concerns from anyone?
Phil, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Sort of not related to what you were talking about.
That's all right. It's allowed.
I was just wondering, so where it's so competitive for buyers and there's, usually multiple offers, are you seeing that, like, let's say you're representing the buyer and you get to inspection and there's some items that, the buyer wants resolved. Because I know that if you request the seller to fix them or to credit, closing costs, whatever, that technically you're opening up the contract. So could the seller just walk away at that point and say, well, I had, 6 other offers, I'll just go back to one of those offers? Like, is that something that's happening that you should be concerned about as a buyer's agent?
I mean, really, no, because legally, contractually, the seller does not have an out. Just simply because you're technically not opening the contract back up. I mean, you are attempting to renegotiate something, but the seller has the right to say no, and the buyer has the right to proceed with the original contract. The buyer, this is what I go back to when I said, the seller's kind of helpless and the buyer has all the control, certainly through the investigation process. The buyer has a unilateral, we can void, we can walk, we don't have to tell you why. I mean, trust me.
Can you hear me, Bill?
Yeah.
I think to answer Megan's question, if you use the ICA form, section 2, which is the modification of agreement, says, without waiving the right to proceed under the original terms of the contract, the buyer wants to address an issue. So if the seller says no, they won't repair it, the buyer can still move forward with buying the house without the item repaired. Great
answer, Rusty. Yep,
that makes sense.
It's all covered in there legally. I mean, has it ever caused a problem? Has a seller ever, tried to walk away because the buyer raised some issues or said, I
did have a seller who said, if you ask for anything after inspection, we're just going to walk away. And I wasn't like, I'm a new agent, so I'm not. I thought, well, I am, like, especially if you ask for closing costs, I was thinking, well, that is changing the original, purchase and sale agreement. So I wasn't sure.
Well, again, the buyer can't change it themselves. They would need the seller's agreement, and the seller can say no, in which case the agreement is not changed and the buyer, has their own remedies. But again, the seller can't legally walk away. I mean, a seller legally really has they have no option to walk away. The buyer can walk away, of their own choice because of inspections. They, maybe the appraisal fails, maybe their loan doesn't go through. I mean, the buyer has a lot of outs, title issues. The seller has no outs legally, but I'm not going to mislead anyone. I mean, a handful of times in 25 years, we've had sellers who, personal reasons, job reasons, whatever, marriage issues, we'd get a call the week before closing and they said, we're not closing. We know this puts the buyer in a tough spot. We're sorry, but we're not selling our home. We will not be at closing. And that, puts the buyer in a tough spot. They can try to sue the seller for specific performance, but that could take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars. Usually the buyer's just going to walk away and go buy something else. So the seller doesn't have the legal recourse to walk away or not close just because the buyer asked for something. But that doesn't mean it would never, ever be an issue, but legally, contractually, as per the clause Rusty just pointed out, they don't have the right to do that, but that doesn't mean that they, you won't ever have a situation that's an issue.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and so it's a good thing, you know, to educate. So you were working for the buyer, you said, in that case?
Yeah, I was working for the buyer.
Yeah. Yeah, so we talked about how you're conveying reports to the seller. I wanted to mention a little pet peeve that I have. Oftentimes I don't work with a lot of buyers, so oftentimes I'm the listing agent, and I'll get a call from the buyer's agent, and maybe some of you can set me straight on this if I'm wrong, but I'll get the call, and the buyer agent wants to call me to discuss the inspections. I'm not a real big fan of this. And it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, because to me, there's not really anything for me and the buyer agent to discuss. Like, okay, you've got reports, you and the buyer have talked about it. You've got an ICA request, whatever, but this is not my house. These aren't my issues. Maybe I'm driving, what you're going to call me and you're going to want to discuss a bunch of stuff that I'm supposed to remember all this. I'm supposed to call my client and tell them, I don't know. I mean, I'm just kind of like, send me a text, send me an email, send me some report, send me an ICA request. Like, the only thing I can act on is an ICA request. I mean, that's the bottom line. There can be 30 issues, but I need to know what your buyer wants, what they're asking for. And again, I already hate this process. I've been honest about it. So I tend to get irritated immediately when I get those calls, because I just don't think there's a lot for the buyer and listing agent to discuss, because we can't negotiate anything. I don't know if the buyer agent's trying to, pump me for some information, or, whatever the case might be. But I just really feel like if you're the buyer agent, you should be communicating this stuff in writing, probably by email. It's just so much easier to forward an email to a client, forward a text to a client, forward a report to the client, and go about it that way than a bunch of phone calls and, agent discussions that ultimately lead to nowhere. Am I off base on that? Do I need to check myself on that? How are you guys doing it?
Is it just because is it just a feel like a time waste for you, or are you just afraid it's going to lead to something?
It definitely feels like a time waste. I mean, I was probably hoping everything would go smoothly, and now they're calling to tell me things are not going to go smoothly. Again, they want to give me a laundry list of things that are wrong. And unless I'm not driving and I'm in a position where I can write everything down, which of course I still don't want to do, I usually end up politely saying, okay, well, this is all great information. Can you send it in an email? Or, they're pre-letting me know that the septic failed, but they don't have the report yet. But ultimately what I need is the report to kind of move forward. If they're saying, okay, we're definitely going to ask for this, we want you to know ahead of time, maybe my seller wants to get a second opinion, whatever. But my advice would be, when you're on the buying agent side, or if you're on the listing agent side, request that information in writing. Don't get into a lot of discussions, over the phone, because you're not talking to the person that has the power to do anything about anything anyway. I do try to prepare my sellers ahead of time, so that they're not calling me, 10 minutes after the inspection is over looking for information. I'm like, look, it's going to take a couple days after for us to really start getting some information. The buyer's got reports they have to receive. They need to look them over. They need to decide what they want to do. So it is. And again, I'm going to go right back to it. The most stressful time, I think, for a seller is the 5 business days, the 10 business days, when they are waiting for these inspections to happen, while they're waiting for the results. That could all be avoided if they did pre-inspections, give those to the buyer, fix stuff ahead of time, whatever, before you go on the market. And then you get to avoid this whole contentious, terrible, anxious process of waiting for these inspections to happen, for the results to come in. You know, most of the time, if you're providing a buyer with all sorts of inspection reports ahead of time, they're not going to waste $500 on a septic inspection when you've already given an inspection from, you know, there's only a few really good top companies that are doing this stuff. So it's probably someone they were going to use anyway, or that was on their agent short list. You know, you're providing them a report that's 3 weeks old that says the septic system is in great shape. They're probably not going to waste their money doing an inspection. You know, if they have to have a water test for their loan, yep, they're going to have to do their own. But, you know, again, for the seller, you know, who's already done it, they don't have to worry, generally speaking, how that's going to come out. Yes, radon results can change, but they tend to not fluctuate a whole lot. So anyway, that just back to that pre-inspection process. It saves everybody time and money, and it removes this frightful process from the whole scenario. Last thing I guess I want to cover is a properly written ICA contingency. They don't give us a lot of space on the form to actually ask for stuff. If you are asking for closing costs, I mean, this is what I like to do. I've had a few agents recently, buyer agents from other companies, who didn't do it this way, and it turned out okay. I was just always concerned about raising a red flag with a lender and just putting the request for closing costs on the ICA form, and that's what the lender gets. I always put it on that form and a separate addendum, and then the lender just gets the separate addendum. I mean, the lender's not stupid. The underwriter's not stupid. They know that if a closing costs a request is coming in, you know, 2 weeks after loan application, that it probably has something to do with inspections or something. But I just never wanted to raise a red flag, but I've had a few agents send them to me on the ICA in the past couple months, and I suggested we just put it on a regular addendum for the lender as well, and they didn't want to do that, and so we didn't, and it was never an issue. So that might have been something that I've been doing overkill on for a number of years. But if you are asking for some, you know, a number of items to be corrected, you're probably not going to fit them all on the ICA form. You're probably going to have to, you know, write C addendum 1 and attach an addendum with your actual list of stuff. So obviously the first thing you're going to want to cover is, you know, what's to happen, you know, what is to be repaired. Although this really sort of applies to any contingency. You know, you're going to hear in real estate class that, you know, real estate agents aren't supposed to be writing contingencies. We're not supposed to be formulating contract language. And I guess, you know, the only thing contradictory about that, and it's not necessarily the Realtor Association saying that, it may be a real estate instructor, but, you know, they're giving us all these forms to, you know, to write addendums and amendments and, you know, whatever. So the reality is it's going to happen from time to time. And if you have a cooperative buyer, cooperative seller, it's probably going to work out anyway. If you've got a difficult client, you know, they're going to find some way to get out of the agreement, or they're just simply going to refuse to close, and they don't care if they have a valid reason or not. So yes, I would try to write very carefully worded, proper contingencies that cover every contingency that could occur. But there's going to be times that no matter how well written it was, again, if one of the buyers or sellers gets a hair the wrong way and decides they don't want to close, or they're going to be difficult, they will find a way to make our lives hell. These are going to pop in here wrong. Okay, sorry about that. So who's going to make it happen? You know, who's responsible for it? When does it need to happen? A deadline. I see a lot of inspection contingencies, especially say prior to closing. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean the morning of closing, the day before closing? I mean, if we're getting a repair done that the buyer needs to investigate or check it out, or a lot of our building inspectors are willing to go back for free to re-inspect repair items. So chances are you really need to set that deadline, you know, a week before closing, so there's time to make sure that it actually got done. Who's going to pay for it? That's obviously super important. And then you need to cover, you know, what happens if it doesn't happen. And I'll show you a full written contingency and what that looks like here at the end. You know, any other conditions, you know, that might apply. So, you know, here's one that I wrote. I mean, somebody might be able to pick apart something that I missed. If you did notice, please let me know. But buyer and seller hereby agree that the seller will have a radon air mitigation installed in the home at least 10 days prior to closing. Seller agrees to use a licensed contractor and that the system will be paid for at their own expense. The seller also agrees to pay to have the property retested after installation and provide results to the buyer no later than 5 days prior to closing. If satisfactory results are not obtained, the buyer retains the right to void the contract and have earnest money returned in full. Anybody have any issues with that, or did I forget something? It's quite possible that I did. And obviously this is just one potential scenario, but all right, hearing no objections, I'll continue on. Maybe you have a multiple item contingency where you just want to list, you know, the repairs, and then, you know, just have sort of one clause in the contingency that covers, you know, all of the individual repairs. Obviously, not every contractor needs to be licensed. I mean, certain, you know, plumbing, electrical, those are licensed activities. You know, radon, if it's for the purposes of a real estate transaction, does have to be, you know, done by a certified radon contractor by the state. I will throw out while I'm thinking of it, because it came up a few years ago. So a seller, and this kind of relates to the pre-inspections too, if it's for the purposes of a home sale, the law states that a seller is not allowed to conduct their own radon air or water testing. So I guess, you know, if it's done prior to listing, you know, could the seller argue, well, I was just doing this for my own purposes. You know, I'm not a lawyer, or I don't work on the real estate commission, so I'll you know, leave that one up to interpretation. Certainly if the property is already listed, they can't do it. However, I was told by the Radon Control Board a number of years ago that the retest for, you know, after a system has been installed, that it was perfectly fine for the seller. A lot of the installers, one of the ones that I use, that they include a free test with their installation, and then the seller just has to conduct the test after installation. And I was told by the Maine Radon Control Board that the seller could do that retest to certify just simply that the licensed system that was installed is working, that didn't fall under the no seller testing rules. So that's what I was told. You know, you use that information as you would, but so any questions on these contingencies? Okie dokie. So sort of relating to the last item. So my best tip, I don't know if it's my best one, but it's the final one I'll leave you with. But if you're getting repairs done or estimates or whatever the case may be, my advice is to always use a contractor chosen by the buyer. I mean, obviously, if it's something that's getting done after closing, you know, then that's kind of a non-issue. But if it's something that the seller's getting done before closing, or, you know, you're getting an estimate for something to be done after closing and the contractor gets paid at closing, you get the buyer, if possible, to use a contractor of their choosing. That is going to, you know, save your bacon so many times if there's a problem later, because the buyer agent's not going to be calling you, the buyer's not going to be calling the seller, vice versa, to complain that the seller's contractor didn't do a good job. You know, basically the buyer picked the contractor, so they're theoretically going to be happy with their work, or they can take it up with their own contractor. So, you know, that's kind of the best thing. You know, again, best advice is to do closing costs or leave the repairs up to the buyer after closing. But if the seller ends up having to do stuff, you know, anytime you can use the buyer's contractor and let the buyer coordinate that and the seller simply pays for it, I think you're gonna end up with a better solution. Where do we stand? Any more questions, comments before we wrap this up? Oh, I see something in the chat. I sent it with buyer's permission. What the listing agent we were discussing. Yep. No, that's
what you don't like, Bill, but
no.
But
That's
I do it because it's just it's a way to convey. Like sometimes emails can come across really cold and sort of like sterile. And I know that, yes, you know, we're in a business transaction, but sometimes being able to convey like, hey, listen, I had the conversation with my buyer. There's a lot of little things that they're overlooking. And we're only bringing you these couple of big things. Everything's going to be in writing, but I wanted to give you a heads up. It's sort of like a way to just sort of soften that blow. So it doesn't feel, it's not, there's no way that we're actually doing negotiations in that conversation, but it's a way to sort of like not shock the listing agent so they can kind of prepare themselves to mentally have that conversation with their seller when it does come in. And so it's sort of like a way of just...
You're keeping it folksy. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Keeping it friendly.
Yes, that's what it's really, I'm just too friendly. It's what I...
No, I don't think you can be too friendly in this business. So,
yeah.
And anyone else with any questions or comments before we shut this puppy down? I hope you're all, if you haven't RSVP'd for the company party, please do. Would love to see as many of you as possible on August 3rd. You'll find me at the bar at Point Sebago. And we'll hopefully see a good number of you and maybe some kids or partners or whatever the case might be. So if you haven't gotten back to Shelley on that or messaged on the Facebook message board, do that, and have a good rest of the month of July.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, welcome.